In the last section, we finished going through both of our configuration files, and we're now ready to load these into our Kubernetes cluster and try to access our running container. So in order to do so, we're going to feed both these configuration files into our cluster through the kubectl command line tool. The command in particular that we're going to run is the apply command. So at the command line, we're going to run kubectl apply -f, and then the name of a configuration file, or I should say the path to the configuration file. Now, kubectl, again, that's a command line tool that we use to mess around with everything going on inside of our Kubernetes cluster. The apply keyword means that we want to change the configuration of our cluster, and that's actually kind of a very loaded term. Like these words right here, change the current configuration. That's a real loaded term right there, and it's something that we're going to expand upon at great length in just a little bit. We then specify that we want to load in a file that contains all this configuration that we care about. So we're going to add on the -f flag, and then the path to the file is the path to the file. That's pretty much it. So let's try flipping over to our command line, and we're going to run this command 2 times, one time for the client-pod.yaml file, and one time for the client-nodeport.yaml file. So back in my terminal, I'm going to first make sure that I'm inside of my simple k8s directory, which is where I have those 2 configuration files. I'll then run kubectl apply -f, and let's first load up the client pod. So I'll say client-pod.yaml. I'll hit enter, and then we'll very quickly see that the pod has been configured. Now, what does configured mean? Who knows? That seems a little bit mysterious. So it doesn't really seem to say that the pod was or the container was successfully created. And in fact, this message printed up a little bit too quickly for me to really feel like the container was successfully created. So we might need to do a little bit of a status check here in just a second to make sure that the pod was in fact started up successfully. But before we do, let's apply our other configuration file. So I'll do kubectl apply -f, and then the other file was called client-nodeport. So client-nodeport.yaml. And again, I see configured message right here. Now again, in both cases, it seems like these messages appeared pretty quickly, so I don't really know if everything worked the way we would expect. So let's try figuring out how we can print out the status of both these different objects that we just created, and just make sure that they were in fact successfully created. So in order to get the status of any different object that you and I create through a configuration file or any other means, we're going to be making use of the kubectl get command. The get command is going to print out the status of an entire group of object types. So for example, we would say kubectl get pods. In this case, pods is the type of object that we want to get information about. kubectl will look at our Kubernetes cluster, it'll find all the different pods that have been created, and it'll print out the status of every single one. So it's a very easy way to get a kind of high-level look at everything that's going on inside of your cluster. So I'll do kubectl get pods at my terminal, and I'll see that I have one pod created. It has a name of client pod. 1 of 1 right here means that there is one copy of it running, and we need to have one copy running. So the first number right here is the number of pods that are running, and the second number is the number of copies that we want to have. As we start to scale our application, we might want to have multiple copies of the exact same pod running. And so when that happens, you would expect to see one right here change to 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it might be. We then see that the status is running, so it definitely looks like everything started up a-okay. There have not been any restarts, so if your pod right here crashes for any given reason, it will be automatically restarted, and you would see restarts right there increment by 1. And then age of 1 hour means it's been running for 1 hour. Now, in my case, the thing has not actually been running for 1 hour. I just started up this pod a while ago, and I forgot to close it before running the apply command, but not a big deal. You're going to see a age of 1 minute or something like that. Okay, so now we're going to get the status of all the different services that we have created as well. So to get a printout of all of our different services, we're just going to slightly change the kubectl get command. We're going to say that we want to get a printout of all the objects with type service that we have created. So I'll say kubectl get services. And that's going to print out 2 different services. Now, chances are you have two services running as well. One might be Kubernetes with a type of cluster IP. If you see that, that's one of the inner workings of Kubernetes, and you can completely ignore that thing. Now, hopefully, you're going to see a second service printed out in here with the name of client node port. Its type will be, of course, node port. It'll have a cluster IP, an external IP, and then a listing of ports and age over here as well. Now, I want you to look very closely at port over here. You'll notice that there's both the port property and the node port property as well. And so as a quick reminder, the first number on there, where's our diagram? Here we go. So the first number on there is the port. That is the port that other pods or other objects would use to access the service that this thing the pod that this service points to. The second number is the node port. And so that is the port that you and I would use to access that service inside of our browser. You will notice that the one port that is not reflected inside of here is the target port. So the service does not report the port that is trying to open up inside the target pod. That's not done for any security issues. It's just done because, like, who cares? Who cares, right? For that print up, you probably don't care about the target port. You probably only care about the port property and the node port. All right, so that's pretty much it. We have now deployed both of these objects, and they are now running on our local cluster. So now the very last thing we have to do is attempt to access our running multi-client project inside of our browser. Now, you might expect, and based on my wording right now, as you might guess, this is not the way we do it. You might expect that we would go to localhost : and then whatever we put in as the node port over here, 31515. Remember, this is the port that we use to access or test out our container inside the browser. So you might think that we go to localhost : 35151 or whatever. I keep mistyping that thing. I'm just going to do a copy paste. There we go. So of course, when you go there, yeah, nothing works. So what's going on? Well, remember what is going on behind the scenes on your computer right now. Let's pull up a good diagram for this. This one right here. This will do. Let's do this one. Okay. So when we are inside of our browser, when we want to access some container that is running on that Kubernetes node VM created by Minikube, this is not addressed by localhost. In other words, all the ports that exist inside this node VM right here are not available on localhost. In order to access this VM, we need to actually ask Minikube for the IP address that was assigned to this virtual machine when it was created on your computer. So this virtual machine right here that was created on your machine has its own IP address, and you need to visit that IP address in order to access any of the different services, any different pods that are running inside of here. So to access that IP address, we'll flip back over to our command line, and we're going to run minikube IP, and that's going to print out the IP address of that virtual machine. So at any point in time, forever, inside this course and your own applications, anytime that you want to access some application that is running inside of Minikube or inside of that virtual machine, you are not going to use localhost. Just forget it. There is no localhost, period. No localhost. Anytime that you want to access a service or a container or a pod or whatever it might be that is running on your virtual machine or inside of your Kubernetes cluster, when you're running in development mode, you're going to run Minikube IP, and you're going to use this IP address right here. So hopefully I made that memorable enough. You're not going to use localhost. That's pretty much it. So we're going to copy this right here. I'm going to go back over to my browser. I'm going to put in that IP, and then we're going to specifically access the port, the node port that we set up on that thing. So I'll say : 31515, and I'm going to put that over inside my command line just to make sure it's really clear. Yeah, there's a colon on there. Now remember, your IP address might be very different than mine, so do not go to my IP address. Go to whatever IP you see printed out at your terminal. All right, so we're going to go there, and lo and behold, we see our application appear on the page. Now, of course, if you open up your terminal, you're going to see a couple error messages because this thing is not able to access the Express API. Well, that's totally fine. It's just because we have not actually set up that API inside of our Kubernetes cluster yet. Okay, so that's pretty much it. We have gone through the entire process of creating two different objects, both a pod and a service. We understand the differences between the two, and we understand that we have to create a service if we want to access anything inside of our running pod. Remember, By default, Kubernetes is far more restricted with all of its networking stuff than anything we ever did with Docker Compose or with Elastic Beanstalk. With Kubernetes, we have to be very, very explicit about all the networking that we want to set up. And we do all the networking setup by the creation of these different service things. So that's pretty much it. That's the basics of Kubernetes. So let's take a quick pause right here, and we're going to start looking at some more complex stuff in the next section.